The provincial government is terrible at explaining how and why it does things, how decisions are made, who's the boss, how politicians and public servants work together or don't, why the term public servant is misleading, and maybe not for the reason you're thinking. I've been an assistant deputy minister in BC's Indigenous Relations, Natural Resource and Tourism Ministries, and I want to give Indigenous governments and organizations in what we now call British Columbia some background. Understanding the structure of government makes it easier to figure out who to talk to and when. And if you already deal with the provincial government, you probably know a lot of this, and I'm just pulling together information into one place and trying to help folks who are starting out. And to do that, I've made 2 videos. This first one is about the structure of government because it's not at all obvious how things fit together. The second video builds on that by touching on a number of topics, including tips on meeting with and writing to ministers, how government makes major decisions, the role of the public service, and a quick introduction to its natural resource policies. When you finish these videos, you'll know more about this stuff than most public servants, and I know because I teach this workshop to them. There's one theme I'll keep going back to in this video. There are 2 very different worlds in the thing we call the provincial government, and it's easy to confuse them. And there's a big wall between them that affects communication and makes it difficult to sort out roles and responsibilities. There's the world of the public service, the people who work in ministries and other agencies delivering government programs. Then there's the political world, the elected officials like ministers and the people that work for them in the legislative buildings and their constituency offices. That's an important distinction that's not obvious to the outsider, but is critical to how it all works. And more on that as we go through this. I'm going to move through the dry stuff quickly and try to explain why it's relevant. Canada and BC are constitutional monarchies. And historically, a monarch reigns through a combination of claimed divine authority, conquest, now there's a controversial word, and marriage. Formally, Canada gives the monarch, the Queen, the Crown, her power and authority through the Constitution Act. And that all means that the provincial government also claims its power and authority from the Crown, and more on that later. The Lieutenant Governor, pronounced Lieutenant, British versus Lieutenant, American, is BC's representative of the reigning monarch of Canada. Formally, the Lieutenant Governor is the head of the Executive Council of British Columbia, more commonly known as the Cabinet, and I'll need to refer to it both ways. To be clear, the Lieutenant Governor does not participate in cabinet discussions or deal with the day-to-day business of government. However, the Lieutenant Governor does have constitutional duties, including ensuring the province always has a premier, opening and closing each session of the legislature, and granting royal assent to measures and bills passed by the Legislative Assembly to make them law. Usually, the political party that wins the largest number of seats in a provincial general election is invited by the Lieutenant Governor to form the government, and its leader becomes the head of the provincial government and is known as the Premier. The Premier then advises the Lieutenant Governor on the appointment of the members of Cabinet. And the members of Cabinet are usually selected from the members of the Legislative Assembly, the elected MLAs. But the Lieutenant Governor can also appoint people who haven't been elected, like Grand Chief Ed John, who was Minister of Children and Families back in 2000. And by the way, Ed John wasn't the first Indigenous person to become a minister in BC. That was Frank Calder of the Nisga'a, who had been elected as MLA for Atlan for many years and named a minister in 1972. The Lieutenant Governor reads the speech from the throne at the start of every legislative session. The Premier's office writes that. It's a statement of the elected government's plans and priorities. That's a useful read for people who want to understand the government's strategic direction, and more on that later, too. Members of Cabinet are appointed as ministers, meaning that they're responsible for a ministry. The Premier decides how many ministries there are and what they do, and can change that at any time. Now, that's all subject to the approval of the Lieutenant Governor. You'll hear about parliamentary secretaries, like the Parliamentary Secretary for Environment. That person supports the minister responsible for the environment, but isn't formally part of cabinet. They have some influence, but limited power. There can also be ministers of state. They also support ministers and are not part of cabinet. And the bottom line is that no law can be put in place without the approval of the Lieutenant Governor. Even relatively minor cabinet decisions called orders in council are made under the authority of the Lieutenant Governor. But, for practical purposes, since about 1688, it's been accepted that the elected parliament, in this case, the provincial legislature, holds the power, and the monarch, in this case, the Lieutenant Governor, has limited executive authority. Now, I dragged you through all that to point out that you're dealing with a political structure that hasn't changed much in a few hundred years. So please, do not be surprised when the system doesn't work logically or in any way consistent with the world around it. Key to all this is the concept of cabinet confidences. Everything that goes on in cabinet meetings is confidential. All ministers take an oath to keep cabinet discussions secret. It's meant to ensure that cabinet ministers can discuss all options and express their opinions before they make a collective decision. In turn, cabinet ministers have to support and defend all cabinet decisions, even if they disagree with them. The agendas of cabinet meetings are also confidential, including the date and time that a topic will be discussed. You can imagine that investors would love to know what cabinet is saying about potential approvals for a new mine. In part, because of that, public servants can be fired for discussing cabinet confidences outside of government. So, if you ask a public servant when a decision will be made, if it's a cabinet decision, they may want to tell you, but they really shouldn't. Mind you, there's a good chance that a junior public servant won't be aware of cabinet confidence restrictions, so hey, ask away if you want to. That confidentiality is authorized through the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. It sets out the details about what government can and cannot keep confidential. If the government is refusing to release documents to you, it will probably claim it's doing so under this act. The Lieutenant Governor, on the advice of the Premier, also establishes cabinet committees made up of smaller groups of the cabinet ministers. And these include Treasury Board, where financial decisions are taken, and more on cabinet committees later. To get back to the main point of this video, there are a number of positions that are a part of the political world, in particular a minister's senior ministerial advisor. In the past, that position has been called ministerial assistant and minister's chief of staff, and they work directly with the minister and have their offices in the legislative buildings. And most ministers' offices have 2 senior ministerial advisors and at least 2 ministerial advisors reporting to them. If you contact one, they'll sort out who you should be talking to on a given topic. Minister's office staffing varies from minister to minister, usually based on the size of the ministry. Here's what a minister's office looks like in the government directory. I had deleted the names because it no doubt changed minutes after I downloaded it. The point is that if you go to the government directory, you can find the current staffing and contact information pretty easily. And here's the URL for the Provincial Government directory. Note that the government directory doesn't have contact information for all public servants. It's not common, but sensitive positions can be excluded from the directory to protect the safety of the people working in them. As part of their role in running the minister's office, senior ministerial advisors provide political advice to the minister, and they can take action on political matters like fundraising and what to do to get their minister re-elected, and they coordinate with other ministers' offices. If you want a minister's ear, go to their senior ministerial advisor. And if you're in a meeting, and deputies and other ministry staff quietly leave the room, or ask to change the topic, it's because a purely political matter has been raised. They're not permitted to be part of those discussions. Now, switching to the Premier's office for a moment. While the roles and functions within the Premier's office vary a lot from government to government, there are usually two deputy-level positions that are the heart of the difference between the public service and political worlds. There's a Deputy Minister to the Premier that's designated as the Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Public Service. This deputy is the boss to the deputy ministers from all the ministries. To be clear, a minister does not supervise their deputy minister. That's the role of this position. This is usually a behind-the-scenes position. I've never seen one take a public role on specific issues. But it does take the lead on cross-government initiatives, like the province's relationship with the First Nations Leadership Council. The second deputy-level position in the Premier's office is usually called the Chief of Staff, who's generally responsible for the political side of the Premier's office and supervises the senior ministerial advisors serving the ministers. That's also a very behind-the-scenes position, almost never seen by public servants in the ministries. It is, however, extremely influential, as it's often the closest person to the Premier. The Premier also hires a staff with a variety of duties and titles depending on the priorities of the day, including special advisors on specific topics. Recent premiers have hired Indigenous people like Wade Grant and Don Bain to advise on Indigenous matters. The Premier has two offices, one in the legislative buildings in Victoria and one in Canada Place in Vancouver. Cabinet meetings can happen in either location or both at the same time, and they're linked by a dedicated video conferencing line. And in theory, your meeting with the Premier or a minister can happen in either place. Now, to the ministries. Each has a deputy minister who is formally responsible for its day-to-day operation, its budget, and program development. But really, that job is about giving strategic direction to the ministry and managing the ministry's relationship with the minister and cabinet and other deputies. For practical purposes, deputies delegate most of their operational responsibilities to assistant deputy ministers. You'll also run into associate deputy ministers. They're assigned specific programs, and they rank between deputy ministers and assistant deputy ministers. They're all chosen for their ability to provide non-partisan advice to ministers, meaning that it's advice without political bias. And they're moved from ministry to ministry based on where their particular skill set is needed most. They're rarely given a choice about that. And unlike the rest of the positions in a ministry, they're not union or arguably even management. They're appointed by Order in Council, which gives government the power to hire and fire them at will without being bogged down by the procedures of the Public Service Agency. They're expected to work together across ministries to achieve government's goals, and they expect that same level of inter-ministry collaboration from their staff. But that's harder in reality, given that ministry staff are usually focused on meeting their own ministry's goals, and you've probably seen that already. Deputies have to balance the direction given to them by their minister and the deputy to the Premier. But in theory, everyone is working based on an understanding of government's strategic goals, and that comes from the political platform of the party in power, and you can find that on the party's website. And that platform is the basis for the elected government's strategies, plans, and initiatives. And you can find those on the official provincial government website, gov.bc.ca. Those priorities dictate what's in the speech from the throne at the start of each session of the legislature, and the budget speech given by the Minister of Finance annually on Budget Day. But the specific direction for ministries is found in the mandate letters sent by the Premier to individual ministers. They provide direction about budget and achieving broad government goals, and set expectations for that ministry's programs and initiatives. They're useful reading before you negotiate with a ministry. All the mandate letters are on the government website, and of course, if you want to hide something, put it on a government website. The test for a public servant is what's being proposed consistent with these sources? Does it support government's stated goals and initiatives? Ministries are also required to write annual service plans that demonstrate how they intend to deliver on that strategic direction, and in due course write service plan reports that summarize the results of those efforts. Now, reading a ministry service plan will give you a clear idea of the top priorities of that ministry, but neither the minister's mandate letter nor the service plan can capture all ministry activities, just the highlights, which often surprises and disappoints clients and staff of those ministries who may not see themselves reflected in those documents. Okay, I'm making it sound like government is all about the ministries, and that's definitely not so. There are the central agencies that include the Public Service Agency, the Office of the Chief Information Officer, and the Office of the Comptroller General, among several others. They're about how the government runs itself, and you'll rarely deal with them. And there are the other public sector organizations that deliver programs and services on behalf of specific ministries, and those organizations include the Crown corporations. There are two types of Crown corporations out there. Commercial Crown corporations are legal entities separate from the provincial government that are meant to deliver services and programs for a profit. BC Hydro, BC Lottery Corporation, and ICBC, for example. Service Crown corporations are also separate legal entities, but they're largely funded by government and aren't expected to turn a profit. Destination BC and BC Housing, for example. So when I say on behalf of, I mean that a given Crown corporation reports to a given ministry. So Destination BC to the Tourism Ministry, for example. Now, Crown corporations are created for several reasons. There may be a political interest in having a function delivered separately from government to allow more freedom of operation than a government ministry might have. And some Crown corporations have used this legal distance to claim that they're not bound by the honor of the Crown in dealing with Indigenous rights and title. However, the responsible minister will make it clear that the Crown Corporation is expected to assume the Crown's obligations to consult with, and where appropriate accommodate, Indigenous peoples. Then there's the such sector: schools, universities, colleges, and health authorities. They're also separate legal entities, and they get government funding and collect some fees. UBC and the Vancouver Coastal Health Authority are examples of that. Then there are advisory boards that provide advisory services to ministers and government. They're not separate legal entities. And finally, tribunals. Tribunals are created to perform adjudicative functions independent of government, and they may or may not be separate legal entities. They include the BC Human Rights Tribunal, the BC Utilities Commission, and the Civil Resolution Tribunal. BC also has 8 nonpartisan statutory offices that support the Legislative Assembly by carrying out important functions like the monitoring of government programs and performance. And they're headed by independent officers like the Auditor General and the Chief Electoral Officer, who are appointed by and report to the Legislative Assembly. Okay, what about something like the Oil and Gas Commission? Bodies like that are established by enabling legislation. In that case, the Oil and Gas Activities Act. That declares them as an agent of government and outlines how they're governed. In this case, it's having the deputy minister of the responsible ministry as the chair of the board. So, if you have a concern with the Oil and Gas Commission, for example, you can raise it with the deputy or the minister of the Energy Ministry. Okay, I'm going to bring up the budget cycle, because if you want government to spend some money, timing is everything. And while policy and legislation are created over irregular and, in the case of legislation, long timeframes, the BC budget cycle is set annually. And while Cabinet meets several times a month, depending on the time of year, the Legislative Assembly usually only sits twice a year in spring and fall, and that's referred to as when the House sits. The fall session can be moved or cancelled, or sessions can be added, but the spring session is critical because of its part in the budget cycle. The session is opened by the Lieutenant Governor giving the speech from the throne. The Minister of Finance then gives the budget address on the third Tuesday of February, known as Budget Day. During the address, the minister speaks to government plans and policy for the next year starting April 1st, and tables the estimates, which are a detailed breakdown of the proposed expenditures for each ministry and agency. And those estimates are then debated over a period of weeks, with each minister responding to questions from the opposition critic and other opposition MLAs. Eventually, in the budget cycle, a final supply bill is produced that, when approved, provides authorization for government spending for the next year. And that's the start of the annual planning and reporting that continues to the next budget day. The key point is that budgets for the next year are effectively drawn up months ahead while still in the pre-budget day planning process. So getting new money approved, meaning money not already in a ministry budget, is very difficult and often must come from a limited allocation known as contingencies, which is managed by the Cabinet Committee known as Treasury Board. The amount in contingencies is kept small to keep the total amount of the provincial budget as low as possible. About elections. By legislation, elections are to be held every 4 years on the second Tuesday in May or earlier. And the election period begins when the Premier visits the Lieutenant Governor and requests that the legislature be dissolved. That's usually called when the writ is dropped, and dropped is a very old contraction of drawn up, and the writ refers to the writ of election. Now, I've included this because if the provincial government decision you need falls in the election period, you'll have a long wait. Formally, the period between the writ and the election day is called the interregnum, and the period between election day and the installation of the new government by the Lieutenant Governor is called the transition period. And throughout both, with the old government effectively without a mandate from the people, and the new one not yet put in place by the Lieutenant Governor, the public service assumes a caretaker role, and all but routine decisions are delayed until the new government is in place. And there's still a transition period even if the same party is re-elected. The government is considered new each time it's established by the Lieutenant Governor, in part because its members can change based on the election results. So, okay, I'm going to end this session here, and we've made it through the dry stuff. As I said at the start, the next session covers a lot of topics, including some tips that might help make things a little less frustrating for you. Thank you for watching.